organ. So today we're looking at the lungs.
I think I'm getting the black lung bug.
So we're going to just get on with the lungs. This is talking about metal lungs. Hi, I'm Marie Hopkinson. I'm a Chinese medicine practitioner and welcome to Chinese Medicine Study Buddy. So we're just going to move on to the regulating the water passages. That's number 4 in the functions. This kind of relates to what we were just talking about now. So often with lung patterns, you can see lung disharmonies, lung organ disharmonies. You can see a correlation between the transformation and transportation of water. So the lungs don't like the upper jowl is like a fine mist, and the lungs don't like moisture in there. They don't want to be completely dry, but they don't like moisture. And that's whenever you get a lung condition like a cough, there's a little bit of moisture there. And so the body, even if it's a dry cough, there's something there that needs to be kind of coughed out, was causing this irritation. So and then you can go from anything from a dry cough to a phlegmy, different kinds of phlegm and things like that. And so the body, the lungs itself doesn't like that moisture, and if there's ever that moisture in there, it's then wants to expel that moisture out by causing you to have a cough. So here it says, after receiving the refined fluids from the spleen, the lungs reduce them into a fine mist and spray them through the areas of the skin. So where do the fluids come from? The fluids come from your diet, from drinking, like this. Those fluids go into your stomach, your spleen then transports that. So that's the transformation and transportation. So if it's just water, there's no transforming to do because it's just a pure liquid, purely in. Then it's going to be transported to the lungs, and the lungs are going to do the job of spraying it around and moisturizing everywhere that it needs to go. So a patient might say things like, oh, I drink a lot of water, but I'm so dry. So what's the problem there? Well, it's not that they're not putting the right substance in their body. They're putting the water in their body, but their body, somewhere along the way from it getting into their stomach to being sprayed out. And so you're kind of tracing this back as a little detective. That's your job as a practitioner, to go, okay, right, so you're drinking the water. What's happening then? Is it a spleen issue where it's not transforming or transporting, let's say, just if it's just water they're drinking, transporting the fluids? Is that not happening? Or are the lungs not able to disperse and regulate the water passages? So this process of dispersing relates to the lungs. In health, the fluids are evenly spread all over the body, and the opening and closing of the pores is normal. If this function is impaired, the fluids might accumulate and give rise to edema. So this is cases where you'll see people with puffiness in their limbs, puffy face, puffy edematous hands or feet, things like that. And like these things are usually something has happened, like it could be from a surgical reason, and that you could say, well, because they had the surgery, then that now they've got, like I've seen patients with lymphedema, let's say they've had breast cancer, and then next thing you know, they've got, after all the surgery and everything's happened, they've got a really, really puffy hand or arm or something like that. There's a physiological, like a trauma that's happened in that area that stopped that circulation, but at the same time, you want to look at the lungs and the spleen as maybe they've had more strain placed on them because of all this trauma and because of this, not just the trauma of the surgery, but the cancer that happened at the beginning or all this kind of stuff. You're looking at those, have now the lung and spleen, the pressure on them been, is it too great? And some of these things you can't fix or stop. You can only alleviate it, or you can lessen the effect of it, but you might not be able to completely, the person might never be able to completely go back to normal. And that's on a case-by-case basis. But I guess I'm getting at, like, you don't want to, just because they've had a trauma and they've had a surgical intervention and now this edema has happened, doesn't mean that you can't look at helping the lung and the spleen to kind of improve their functionality in that aspect. So yeah, and this is very commonly in the lower limbs can happen, just not from a surgery or anything, but just that a person gets like puffy ankles, or even when they fly, this could be a thing that happens. You know, people that get swollen ankles, things like that, from swollen limbs from flying. The lungs also direct the fluids down to the kidneys and the bladder. The kidneys receive the fluids and vaporize part of those before sending them back up to the lungs and keep them moist. The lungs' job of directing fluids downwards also has an influence on the bladder function. If this lung function is normal, urination will be normal, but if it's impaired, there may be urinary retention, especially in older people. For this reason, the lungs are sometimes called the upper source of water. I'm not going to read every single thing in this book. And just bear in mind, like this kind of content that I'm doing is probably going to be an hour in total, maybe a little bit less than that. In a lecture, this would be 3 hours probably. There'd be more time for questions, and there'd be a little break time and things like that. But I'm condensing this stuff down. It's not comprehensive. Like, I'm not going to be able to cover every single thing. So next one is controls the skin and the hair. So this is something to think of, again, in a pathological sense. So if a patient has problems with the skin and hair, like what problems could they have? They could have skin diseases. Why would they have skin diseases? Because the lungs aren't spraying the fluids properly. They're not moisturizing the skin. That would be the most obvious connection to the lungs. It could be because of the lungs not moving the chi, not circulating the chi properly, and so therefore then the blood gets deficient. The blood flow isn't adequate to those areas, and so the skin is suffering in those areas, and becomes really dry. So either way, it's like a dryness that can often happen in the skin from these conditions. It's not so much like boils or carbuncles or something like that, although sometimes those things can manifest on the skin because of deficiency. So if there was sufficient yang and sufficient circulation in areas, because we're talking about the lungs, probably should use the word qi more than yang, but if there was sufficient circulation there, then when these things like even fungal diseases of the skin, that kind of stuff, then the body should be able to mobilize its defense when this stuff starts to happen. Say, hey, don't stop. This fungus shouldn't be able to set up camp and start, growing and spreading if the person's healthier. But if they're less healthier, which means, they've got less circulation. So if a person, like how this kind of relates in a Chinese medicine sense in the circulation thing is, if you're qi deficient or you're blood deficient, or any kind of deficient, your body's going to give all the best resource to the inner parts of here and less resource to the hands and the feet. Not always, but sometimes a common occurrence is people who are deficient are unhealthy in their physical body in terms of they're like less active, and so that in itself, if they were a bit more active, that might help their circulation and get more blood flow to their limbs. But because they're not using their limbs and then they get overweight, it's just it's like a catch-22, like a cycle that then, the blood flow, because they're not using their limbs as much, their body's not putting the blood flow there. It's mostly putting it into the inner parts here. So when you go for a run or you go for a walk, you're pushing the circulation to those areas. The more you sit around and you don't walk and you don't exercise as much, whatever exercise you do, then your body's on a regular basis less likely to put circulation to the limbs. So those kind of infections and things like that can happen sometimes. And this could be common in patients that are immune compromised type of patients, like people who have diabetes. You see this presentation commonly, like they get that edematous kind of limbs, they can easily get less lack of feeling in areas, so they don't notice when there's areas that are dying or don't have good blood flow, things like that. So regulating the water passages, controlling the skin and the hair. So controlling the skin in that way, and the hair is seen as like an extension of the skin. So here in Giovanni, he says, let's have a quick look. It says the skin, if the lung function of dispersing fluids is normal, the skin will have luster and the hair will be glossy. And the opening and the closing of the pores and sweating will be normal. If this function is impaired, the skin and the hair will be deprived of nourishment and moisture, and the skin may be rough and dry, and the hair will have a withered and dry quality. Now, it's important to notice as a practitioner, like if you think, oh, that person's got withered and dry hair, are they dyeing their hair all the time? Are they doing something else? Are they doing treatments to their hair? Like those things are also contributing from an external perspective. So people that use hair straighteners all the time, and I'm one of those people that's like constantly using a hair straightener. That makes your hair withered and dry. So yeah, you can't just go on those symptoms alone, I guess is what I'm saying. Just be aware of these other factors and things like that. But I do have patients that will complain, like it's a concern for them that, okay, my hair seemed to suddenly get drier or got drier, more dry recently. Skin in the hairs is relating to the pores. It relates to the defensive chi flowing around those, circulating properly in those areas. Number 6 opens into the nose. So this makes sense in terms of what I said at the very start, like the nose is your best defense against breathing something into your lungs that's going to hurt your lungs. So small particles, even toxic things that might be collected in the nose, in the hair that you can breathe, can blow out, stops it going directly into the lungs. So in a Chinese medicine sense, it says if lung qi is strong, the nose will be open, respiration will be easy, and the sense of smell will be normal. So this is something that's really interesting, is that so I've had some patients with just a decreased sense of smell, and they don't have any reason. Western medicine can't find a reason for it. So that is a treatment avenue for you in Chinese medicine. So if someone has a decreased sense of smell, or decreased ability to smell, or smelling ability, I think, read it put like that, then treating that patient through the lungs could be a possibility. And how would you know to do that? Well, if they say, okay, my complaint is a decreased sense of smell, then you need to go through a diagnostic process to kind of work out, is the lungs, something that's deficient here, and you'd be looking for other things that the lungs do, and this is where you need to know these things that we're talking about, these functions of the lungs. So you'd be asking them things like, do you easily catch colds and flus? Do they have dryness in their skin or any skin problems? Withered hair, thinking of those things. Their ability to breathe, like do they have, and looking at how they breathe and that kind of stuff could be part of it. Okay, so that's number 6. The last one is houses the corporeal soul. So the Po is part of this. Now, you in Chinese medicine school, you will go through mental emotional functions as a separate thing, as a separate subject. And Giovanni's has quite good stuff on this in the second edition of this book, like a lot more of a detail there. And also there's other, what I'm getting at is this isn't the only time you're going to cover this, so you'll probably cover it in mental emotional stuff as well. So what is the Po? You have 2 parts of your soul in Chinese medicine. You have the ethereal soul, the Hun, which relates to the liver. We talked about that in the first time when I did liver. And then you have the corporeal soul, the Po. So the Po is the yin, or the physical aspect of the yang part of the soul, the Hun. And the corporeal soul is considered the most physical part of the soul. So the yin aspect is the most dense or physical, it's more tangible than the other Hun part of the soul. The corporeal soul is closely related to essence and could be said to be a manifestation of essence in the sphere of sensation and feelings. Essence is the foundation for a healthy body, and the corporeal soul, or the Po, makes for sharp and clear sensations and movements. So it's closely related to breathing because it's relating to the lungs. And can be another way to think of it is the direct manifestation of the breath of life, right? So how do we have life? In our physical body is all yin without any life in it. That's the yang. So the yang or the qi, the air that you breathe, the qi that you breathe is a yang aspect. So I guess this aspect of the po being relating to the breathing, you can kind of see this in people that, who are artificially being able to breathe by themselves, who aren't able to breathe by themselves and given mechanical ventilation, let's say. Is that interfering with their po? And how do they get the ability to basically breathe back on their own again? Is that a po? That's a po function of... So all these things, the po, the hun, are all parts of the shen, which is your consciousness, right? So it's often relating to, like, if a person goes unconscious, they could still be breathing. But if a person goes unconscious and isn't breathing, then you would think of that as, okay, their po isn't functioning for them not to be breathing. So yeah, that's one of the things here. Now, so on an emotional level, some really interesting things about the po bring the connection between the emotions and the physical body. So Chinese medicine, the mental emotional aspects of Chinese medicine are treated through the physical organs. So the emotion that's related to the lungs is grief, and that's through the po. And it's also the ability to let go and to move on and to have adventurous kind of life, to go on adventures, to go on holidays, to be out of your house. That's a person who has a healthy po. And that's an aspect of their lungs. Now, often people who are hoarders often become much more housebound through whatever mechanisms. It's because maybe they feel safe at home, or they don't want other people in their space and things like that, and they like all their stuff around them. They don't like change, that kind of stuff. That's an aspect that could be treated in Chinese medicine through the po, through the lungs, that kind of thing. And often those people who get like that can have grief or sadness issues going on there. So it's natural to have grief, and when something sad has happened or something horrible has happened, there's a grieving process. That's why we call it that. And in Chinese medicine, how we would help someone who's got an abnormal response to grief would be looking at the lungs, looking at the po and the lungs and those aspects. And in an acupuncture sense, that's when you're using, often the outer bladder channel points relate to these mental, emotional, spiritual type functions of the physical element organs. But the first way to look at treating this would be to, and the easiest way to look at treating it would be to shore up the solidarity and the functionality of the physical organ. So for instance, if a patient had a grief, a deep sadness, or it could even, types of depression can be related to this kind of thing. A person can't get out of that slump, and they just, they often have this kind of difficulty breathing and the sighing and things like that, and the heaviness, kind of a weight feeling and that kind of stuff. It's all related to metal and to the lungs. Even can be this difficulty of letting go can be relating to your large intestine metal element. So the ability to let go of your bowels and kind of let go of stuff and moving on and things like that. And look, sometimes these things have a two-pronged approach. Like if you can mentally let go of stuff, like physical stuff that you need to let go of, then that could have an effect on your metal element, and then in turn affects your lungs. So this kind of has this vice versa effect of the chicken before the egg. Which one do you treat first? So as a practitioner, you kind of go about treating the physical as much as you can, as much as you possibly can first. But don't discount the impact of these mental and the psychological effects of things having an impact on people physically as well. So this is something really interesting, and I hope that there's a couple other little things here. He said the soul, like the lungs govern the voice. That makes sense, the strength of the voice. So that's to do with breathing, your ability to breathe, your ability to project your voice. So if you find you have patients that have a low voice, like the Seinfeld low talker, I can hardly hear you, you're a low talker. That relates to the lungs and the voice. If you have a very bombastic, loud person that can't control their voice, and they can't hear that they're so loud, that could be a person that's, especially with kids, they can be born with, like when we're kids, we have, much, much more yang, and they could have a very strong lung capacity and very strong lung chi, and metal element is very strong. But the tone of the voice is also relating, and this is something that's more discussed and more prominent in 5-element style acupuncture, where they think of how a person sounds, like how their voice sounds relates to different elements. And so in a general sense, if a person has problems with their voice, so I've had some patients who've had a trauma happen to them, and then they had a low voice, like they could hardly get their voice out, like they just were, it's like they were in a shock, but a prolonged state of shock. And if they got stressed, then their voice they just couldn't power the voice. So it's like the chi, your lung chi powers your voice. And I'm sure that you've noticed it yourself, like if you talk, like in my job I talk a lot, in lots of jobs that I do. So in my teaching job, I could have a day where I may be talking at this level and probably a little bit louder than this, maybe for 6 hours in a day. And then sometimes I'll go and do that, and then I'll interview people on my podcast, or talk on the channel and things like that, make videos. I do singing, and sometimes I'll have a gig. And there's nothing worse than being tired, like physically tired, and then needing to use your voice. And you notice it, like you think, if you don't have good sleep, then, your voice gets worn out. And you see this a lot with singers that go on tour. Then like just the toll of being on tour and eating crappy foods, and not being able to be in the same bed all the time, and not having those kinds of things that nourish your body and help your body. Eventually you get tired, and then you get sick. And so this is like the first thing that happens when you get run down is often your voice gets croaky or not good, or just not at that optimum quality. So yeah, I could go on and on about that, because I know lots about the voice, but you'll hear it in people's voices, right? So this is something you want to listen to. You might not be able to tell if it's the first time you've met someone, because that might just be how they talk. Then maybe they talk like that because they have a chronic, lung deficiency or some kind of metal element deficiency. But if you know that person and you can sort of hear it in their voice, and you think, okay, maybe that's they've either had something physically happen, not good sleep, not good food nourishment, things like that, not breathing well, or they've had an emotional thing that's happened, and that's caused them to lose some of their, like the lung chi's ability to power the voice and to kind of do that. So I hope this video has been useful and helpful to you. Thank you so much for people that have been commenting, and that helps me if this is helping you, and helps me to know that it's helping you. And if you have particular questions or other things you'd like me to talk about, I'll endeavour to to answer them, to do that. I'm working my way through the Zang Fu, and then after that I'm open to ideas for the Study Buddy series that we're doing now. So if you've got an idea of something you'd like to talk about, this is much more detailed, and this is how I would talk to my students in a class. But I'm just kind of ad-libbing a little bit here in these ones, so it's kind of Marie style of Study Buddy. So yeah, I hope this has been useful and helpful to you, and I look forward to seeing you again on the next video soon. Thank you.